So I'm going to begin just by talking a bit more broadly about nursing in the First World War. I know there'll be some very knowledgeable people in this Zoom room this evening, but I thought for those of you who weren't as aware, it might be useful to begin with an overview of that before I talk more specifically about nursing the enemy. So during the course of the war, hundreds of thousands of women were mobilised for military nursing work, both in their home nations and on military fronts. These comprised trained nurses, religious nursing orders, and volunteers. The volunteers included women who'd undergone some limited training in the years preceding 1914, usually via National Red Cross societies, and those who volunteered for the first time during the war. And there were, in some contexts, also some male nurses. In Britain, in the early months of the war, there were around 2,300 members of the military nursing units, the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service and its reserve, and the Territorial Force Nursing Service. And by the end of the war, approximately 20 to 24,000 British trained nurses were involved in some form of war nursing. And of course, the war was a global war, so I am today going to be talking not just about British women, and one of the ways in which the British numbers of nurses were swelled was from what were then called the Dominions. So from 1915 onwards, British nurses were joined by trained nurses from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and from 1917 by over 21,000 women from the US Army Nurse Corps. British volunteer nurses, who numbered over 70,000 in total, were members of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or VADs, which had formed in 1909 and was organised under the auspices of the British Red Cross Society and the Order of St John. And this is a photograph actually of some Liverpool VADs when I was shown around our special collections and archives in the university that I joined quite recently. This was one of the treasures that I found. So other nations in the First World War followed the same pattern of a combination of trained nurses, who usually, at least at the beginning, undertook more of the skilled nursing work, and volunteers who then would carry out more of the domestic work in the wards. France and Germany, though, had relatively low numbers of trained secular nurses. There were around 6,000 French professional secular nurses employed by the state, the assistance publique, and about 2,500 women in the German professional organisation of nurses. So the majority of French and German war nurses worked for their national Red Cross societies. In France, there were about 100,000 women belonging to 3 societies that made up the French Red Cross, and they worked alongside another 10,000 or so members of Catholic nursing orders. In Germany, there were again between 90 and 100,000 Red Cross nurses, of whom about 70,000 were stationed at home and around 20,000 overseas. Unlike in France, German Red Cross nurses included religious nursing orders. So quite a lot of German Red Cross nurses were Protestant deaconesses. And I'm talking about this because I'm going to be quoting from nurses who were French and German, as well as from Britain and the Dominions. So these differences between the types of women who were involved in nursing work in the First World War are important when we're looking at their personal writings and their attitudes towards enemy and prisoner of war patients. Although patients and the general public might not have always made a distinction between a trained or a volunteer nurse, the perspective of a professional nurse who'd already experienced medical trauma and who'd been trained to take emotional distance from her patients was bound to differ from that of an inexperienced volunteer. And this is evident in the memoirs, letters and journals that they left behind. Although I would add that by the end of the war, some of the VADs had gone through what was in effect quite similar, a bit like nurse training themselves. Many nurse leaders, trained women who were leaders in their profession, shared a transnational vision of nursing. and were joining campaigns for state registration, better conditions and standardised training. This kind of transnational vision for nursing as a profession was articulated, for example, by the International Council of Nurses, which was established in 1899 with Brittany, Germany and the US as charter members. So trained nurses sometimes had clear ideas about where their duties lay as medical professionals within a context of war, well before the war broke out in 1914. But what I am going to suggest in my talk today is that once the women who were nursing in the First World War were actually faced with the realities of war nursing, sometimes their pre-existing understandings of their profession and their roles competed or clashed with nationalist discourses that were aiming to rally the different nations to the cause. Volunteers, particularly when they were mobilised for the war effort, sometimes were motivated primarily by appeals to their patriotism and saw their nursing as their duty in a time of national emergency, akin in some senses to male military mobilisation. So while recruitment material for Red Cross nurses did draw on religious understandings or secular understandings of nursing as a kind of sacred duty of care to mankind, it was often attached during the early years of the war to a nationalist rhetoric of duty to homeland. And alongside kind of very positive images of nurses in the war, who were often seen as angelic and patriotic, performing their duty, there were negative evocations of nurses who were seen as not doing their duty properly in the war, who were putting their own interests ahead of their nations. So a historian called Margaret Darrow has written about this in relation to France, where she describes propaganda imagery and popular magazine stories and popular novels with nurses, where there's a kind of good nurse and a bad nurse, or she calls a true and a false nurse. So she talks about the bad nurse, who is often described as a mondaine, which is like a sort of socialite, frivolous young lady. The mondaine embraced rather than abandoned the world, the flesh and the devil, and volunteered to nurse to increase her social capital, to fill her empty hours and to pursue sexual pleasure. While the true nurse inhabited a cell with a nursing manual at her bedside like a breviary, the fashion plate nurse arrived in a limousine dripping with jewellery and self-importance. So when we're looking at women's own accounts of their nursing, I think it's quite important to bear in mind some of the popular images of nursing and nurses that were circulating at the same time, and which influenced not only the way they were seen by other people, but sometimes the way they saw themselves. So one of the sort of groups of women that were often singled out for attack in discourses around nursing in the war were women who were seen to be playing at it, particularly aristocratic women. So this is the Duchess of Sutherland at her hospital in Calais. Lots of aristocratic women put a lot of money and resources into medical care in the First World War, so I don't think we should be dismissing them out of hand, but it is true that this looks perhaps rather posed and a little clean and tidy in terms of a photograph, and a lot of the aristocratic women, I think, were managers, you know, rather than sort of hands-on nurses. So I'm going to talk more broadly today about some of the tensions that you find in the accounts of nursing the enemy that nurses left behind, particularly between the notion of a sort of transnational duty to nurse people, whatever their nationality on the one hand, and feeling that they're doing their duty, their patriotic duty to their homeland on the other. And to start with, I just want to talk about some images of nursing, some sort of nationalist images of nursing in a little bit more detail. So in all of the nations who took part in the First World War, There were posters, postcards, reports, newspaper articles, as well as popular magazines and novels about nurses. And what they tended to do was to show their own medical personnel as offering good medical care, nurses often being seen as angelic, and of the enemy as doing the opposite and failing to care for prisoners of war patients. So accusations of the mistreatment of enemy patients allowed nations, and particularly allied nations, to provide further justification for the line they drew between civilized nations on the one hand and what they call barbaric ones on the other, between the Allies and the Central Powers. In theory, all belligerent nations in the First World War adhered to the humanitarian guidelines established before the war. So the Geneva Convention of 1906, for example, stated that enemy patients must be treated with the same consideration as one's own wounded. And this was also the take of Red Cross societies. So this is a quote from a German Red Cross magazine published in 1917, in which it says the Red Cross sentiment is developed without any aims to personal benefits, in unselfish generosity to friend and enemy, without loyalty to only one confession or faith. But although these references to the importance of the neutrality of care, the impartiality of care by nurses, there were images of enemy nurses which suggested the opposite. So this first poster is quite a well-known poster that evokes the supposed German rejection of the principles of transnational humanitarianism embodied in the Red Cross. So this is shown to be incompatible with the sort of German national identity. So some very typical depictions of German officers looking on sneeringly to the German nurse, who is very much the opposite of positive propaganda images. She's angular, scornful and cruel rather than soft, angelic and maternal. It shows how she fails to live up to the common depictions of nurses as saintly angels, and in fact distorts the image of the Red Cross. This is another image of an enemy nurse. This one is from Belgium, and it shows the nurse. So l'infirmière Boche is the which means the Hun nurse is the caption, and it shows the German nurse as murderous and bestial. So these sorts of nationalist propaganda images that demonized the enemy through claims about the mistreatment of sick or wounded prisoners of war clearly had an impact on public perceptions, and stories of mistreatment began to appear in the nursing press too. Accounts of prisoner of war patients' responses to nurses reveal that beliefs and fears about the mistreatment of the sick and wounded who were taken prisoner were widespread on both sides during the war. So British trained nurse Joan Martin Nicholson, who worked for the Belgian Red Cross, for example, claimed that when she was nursing German patients, she had to reassure them that she was not, quote, going to gouge their eyes out with scissors or put poison in their medicine. A French nun called Sister Eleuthère, who nursed for the whole of the war in Noyon, which was occupied by the Germans in France, made a similar comment in her diary in September 1914, when she said, quote, "The poor man seemed afraid to find himself alone in a ward full of French sisters. No doubt he believed that he was done for and he wanted to leave. Luckily, another German patient arrived to keep him company and reassured him a little." An example taken from a 1936 edited collection of German Red Cross nurses' diaries, field post letters, notes and memoirs also provides evidence that rumours about the mistreatment of POW patients by nurses were still circulating after the 1918 armistice. So in this account, a group of German nurses who'd been imprisoned in Saint-Lazare prison in Paris were subjected to taunts and attacks because it was believed by French locals that they'd been cruel to French patients. So this is a quote from the German memoir. Quote, in Saint-Lazare prison, the rumour went round that these were the evil women who'd murdered wounded soldiers with poison and revolvers. This is what was often claimed in the French newspapers. Thus, people saw these nurses as murderesses. And it's interesting that the quote that I got from the German nurse memoir sort of echoes this the propaganda postcard that was produced by the Allies. And you do get repeated, so I've read, you know, a lot of nurse memoirs, and you get these repeated rumours of poisoning the patient's water as well. So obviously these were sort of typical stories that were going round. But while nurses' personal writings do sometimes reproduce wartime nationalist stereotypes designed to demonise an enemy, they also bear witness to a much more complex set of responses to nursing enemy patients. So in my article, I use a theory by Mary Louise Pratt, who talks about contact zones. She describes these contact zones as social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power. So I find this interesting because thinking about what a hospital was like in the First World War and the sort of complexities of the relationships between patients, nurses, doctors, orderlies, visitors, and the other people who were milling around in hospitals is quite a complex matrix, especially when you put enemy patients into the mix. So it's a strangely sort of intimate space on one level, but in wartime, national and transnational identities are often sort of placed sharply into relief. So one of the things I noticed about some of the nurses' diaries who were nursing enemy patients was they're quite keen to circumvent possible accusations of a lack of patriotism when they're teaching, or they seem too fond of enemy patients. So sometimes they describe the enemy patients like they're specimens of a particular nationality or even a particular race or ethnicity to be sort of characterized and described for the benefit of their readers. But often prolonged contact with POW patients challenged stereotypes, whether they're racial or national stereotypes that had perhaps been internalized by the nurses. So one of the diaries that I found particularly interesting was an unpublished diary written by Kit McNaughton, an Australian trained nurse. Janet Butler has written a book where she extensively quotes Kit's diary called Kitty's War. That's a good read if anybody's interested. So she was in charge of a ward of 45 German POW patients at a base hospital in Boulogne in July 1916. And you can see in her diary that her attitude towards them evolves as the exhausting work of caring for so many seriously wounded and sick young men took its toll. So she initially presents the patient as sort of specimens of the German nation, quite fascinated by seeing real Germans, if you like. She describes that when they're first admitted to her ward, they're kind of objects of fascination to be gazed upon. So she says, quote, "We have all the swank in our ward," as she means the sort of elite, "all the swank in our ward as they come and see the Huns." But as the weeks pass, her tone changes. By the time her first batch of wounded are evacuated, they've become individualized, and she claims them as her German. So this is a quote I've got here on the slide. "Evacuated all my Bosch," so she means they're Germans today, "even my Hein and William Scheller. I hated them going, and so did they, and the poor kids, along with souvenir in the shape of buttons for sister, their eyes filled up when they said goodbye. Of course they're going to write to me, so I can see myself being watched as a German spy." So she writes about her German patients to some extent in a manner similar to that in which she talks about her young Allied patients. But the additional comment about the dangers of corresponding with her German POW patients reveals an awareness of the risks of sounding like she's sympathising too much with the enemy. So in another entry, she states, quote, "This book is filled up with chats re Germans, but I don't mind as long as the fight goes well with us." So despite the shift in her perception of the enemy from the sort of embodiments of Germany to individualised, wounded or sick men, she remains keen to reassure the imagined readers of her diary, and perhaps even herself, of her ongoing patriotism alongside her sympathy as a nurse with the patients for whom she's caring. So similar tensions in relation to the ethics and ambiguities of nursing POW patients were evident across national borders, but the relationship between nurses and enemy patients was also inflected by the context in which they were encountering one another. So in the cases of enemy occupation, where the nurse is nursing under the conditions of occupation, obviously heighten tensions. One of the things that you can see in French nationalist accounts of nursing in German occupied hospitals, for example, does reflect the dominance of anti-German rhetoric in French discourse at the time. So in an article published in 1916, for example, a French nurse called Marthe Furet, if I've got this one, yes, there she is, who was a French Red Cross nurse who nursed in German occupied France, was very critical of the German authorities, but referred to her patients as a collective rather than by nationality, therefore denying any partiality towards her own patients. So she says, "The wounded flooded in, some French, mostly German. They came straight to us from the battlefields. They were seriously wounded. We put them everywhere, in the basement, in the chapel, in the corridors, on the landing. If ever German newspapers claim that French Red Cross nurses refused to nurse Germans, or that they were cared for less well than the French, they are lying. None of my nurses distinguish between their patients. For us, a wounded soldier, whether French, English or German, is a man in pain who needs our help. That's it." Her article does, I'm sure, give an account of the professionalism of the nurses who were there, but it's also in some ways setting up France itself as a civilized nation who treats POW patients well. It was published in 1916 in a French newspaper. So there's a kind of bigger political agenda going on with these sorts of testimonies of war nurses. You can see it too in some German Red Cross nurse accounts. So the collection that was published in 1936, obviously to some extent reflects the hyper-nationalist cult of First World War service common in Nazi Germany. So there's one of the accounts of nursing you get in this 1936 collection is an account by a group of deaconesses who were Red Cross nurses, and they describe the invasion of Belgium in August 1914 as the Franc-Tireur War. So they're suggesting that the invasion wasn't an invasion. This might be ringing contemporary bells to some extent. And they attack the hostility of the Belgian nuns whose convent they have taken over to use as a hospital. They claim that they were being treated like POWs in contravention of the Geneva Conventions when they're forced to nurse under French rule when the French army retake the town of Péronne where they are. And they complain it was necessary to have a French soldier with them when they went into the streets of the town because the inhabitants, they said, had a passionate hatred towards us. So it's very interesting to compare these accounts of nursing on enemy territory, if you like, by nurses, because I think that there are different reasons for publishing these accounts to some extent, and they seem very keen to defend the professionalism of their own work in looking after patients of both their own nations and enemy patients. But you can also see a sort of condemnation of the way that they were treated in quite a lot of the memoirs as well. But you do then get some other accounts of nursing in which you can see a belief in a kind of higher ideal of nursing, in which the enemy is humanised, in which national allegiances are questioned. And sometimes that can be, I think, because there's a strong religious discourse in the nursing memoir, and there were a lot of women who were nursing in the war who were part of religious nursing orders, but also you do get a strong religious faith coming through in some of the trained and volunteer nurses' accounts as well. So I haven't quoted this, but there's a Red Cross German nurse called Mimi Wart, and her account is really interesting because she talks about the importance of spiritual care of her patients as being just as important as medical care, and she's keen to get over the language barriers that she encounters in trying to care for them spiritually as well as medically. So she's nursing enemy patients, but her biggest problem for her is not being able to speak their language. She's also very keen to give them what she calls a good death. So she talks about caring for men of different faiths, Catholic, Orthodox and Muslim. And she's frustrated when she feels she's not able to follow the practices of their faith, or that her language skills are not good enough for her to deal with their needs when they're dying. So in this account, even though it's a German Red Cross nurse published in the same 1936 collection, really for her, nursing is a sacred duty to mankind, and you don't get the same political narrative coming through. Finally, I just wanted to talk about some accounts of nursing that were published after the war, in which nursing the enemy plays a prominent role because they are written with an anti-war or a pacifist agenda in mind. So in these kinds of nurse memoirs, nursing enemy patients is used as an important part of political arguments being made about the futility of warfare. And the best known of these is British VAD nurse Vera Britton's well-known 1933 published memoir. So in Britton's descriptions in Testament of Youth, she criticises the treatment of German POWs by the British authorities, and she challenges the wartime narrative that had held up the Allied treatment of the POW sick and wounded as a differentiating factor between the Allies and the Central Powers. So she says, although we still, this isn't the quote on the, this is a different quote, although we still congratulate ourselves on our impartial care of prisoners, the marquees were often damp, the war was understaffed, and the number of badly wounded and captured Germans became in consequence excessive. She also describes a shift in her own attitudes from one influenced by nationalist propaganda to a sort of humanised and individualised understanding of German patients as suffering individuals. So this is a longish quote which shows that shift in her own mentality as she describes it in 1933. So before the war, I'd never been in Germany and had hardly met any Germans. So it was somewhat disconcerting to be pitchforked all alone into the midst of 30 representatives of the nation which, as I'd repeatedly been told, had crucified Canadians, cut off the hands of babies, and subjected pure and stainless females to unmentionable atrocities. I don't think I'd really believed all those stories, but I wasn't quite sure. I half expected that one or two of the patients would get out of bed and try to rape me, but I soon discovered that none of them were in a position to rape anyone, or indeed to do anything but cling with stupendous exertion to a life in which the scales were already weighted heavily against them. So the crux of the kind of ethical dilemmas bound up in nursing POW patient lies in this tendency to individualise and humanise the enemy within the intimacy of a hospital ward, while being aware that the same individual has potentially threatened or killed one's own soldiers. Taken to its limit, this could lead to a pacifist position in which all war is positioned as absurd, which is what happens in Vera Britton's case. So one of the ways in which Britain does this, for example, is to compare her brother Edward, who was mobilised for the British Army during the war, with her German patients. So she has a quote where she says, "I took the pale fingers of the German patient in mine, thinking how ridiculous it was that I should be holding this man's hand in friendship when perhaps only a week or two earlier, Edward up at Ypres had been doing his best to kill him." This isn't just limited to British nurse writings. You get similar political interpretations of the war in some other former war nurses, particularly a woman I did quite a lot of research for in my book, who was a Red Cross nurse and who became a sort of pacifist and feminist activist like Britain in France in the 1920s and 30s. So when she's trying to recruit women to her political causes in the early 1920s, after she's stopped nursing, she again uses some of these arguments in her pacifist cause. So she says, nurses of France who in hospitals at the rear or in temporary hospitals at the front cared for the bleeding and bruised bodies of the enemies of our country. Didn't you feel in your battle against death that was haunting their bedsides, your hearts beating with a passionate sentiment of human fraternity? So just to sum up some of the kind of arguments that I've been making and some of the quite complex different responses you get in nurse memoirs and accounts of nursing the enemy in the First World War, there's often a degree of hesitation and ambiguity when you read their personal writings. Some nationalist accounts, especially perhaps those written by volunteers in the earlier years of the war, do use nationalist, racial, ethnic stereotypes to depict the enemy patients that they are encountering. Of course, this is partly because of the function of some of these accounts. So if they're published during the war, usually they are a form of propaganda in themselves. Trained nurses often make references to the importance of providing a high standard of care to all patients, but they do sometimes present their care for enemy patients as reluctant. They describe themselves as carrying out a professional duty while deliberately maintaining a distance, as they felt nursing enemy patients wasn't compatible with their patriotic task. Other nurses continually emphasise their neutrality as medical personnel towards enemy patients, but with a more political agenda in mind, in an attempt to provide evidence that the nation didn't break with the Geneva Conventions and could claim the moral high ground in a global conflict that saw around 9 million men taken prisoner. But stereotypes of the enemy were usually challenged or at least nuanced by nurses who spent weeks or months looking after POW patients. Even if their political attitudes to the war varied, many nurses wrote of the transformation of their patients from enemies into individual young and vulnerable men with whom they empathised. In rarer cases, this led to friendships that survived the war or to an understanding of their patients as the sons and husbands of enemy women to whom they owed a duty of care. The confrontation with wounded or sick bodies of the enemy led a few nurses to even question their allegiance to nation. In openly anti-war or pacifist nurse memoirs, especially those published in the interwar years, the encounter with the POW patient is often presented as a crucial moment that revealed the absurdity of war itself, to the nurse narrators. In these cases, nurses adhere more firmly to a conception of their work as a form of religious vocation or a form of transnational humanitarianism, based on an understanding of shared humanity. But I would say that the majority of the memoirs, letters and diaries, whether published or unpublished, that have formed the basis of my research suggest that most women, their responses was not as clear-cut as somebody like Vera Brittain. The shift from the tropes of romanticism to a kind of ironic or realist anti-war narrative that Paul Fussell describes in relation to soldiers doesn't ring true for nurses. All nurses were mobilised as part of national aid efforts that use the rhetoric of patriotic service, even if this was more apparent perhaps in the case of Red Cross volunteers. They were also often influenced by broader gendered understandings of nursing as selfless and nurturing maternal devotion. Trained nurses, as I've said, were sometimes engaged in transnational struggles for professionalisation, with an important emphasis on the standard, consistency and neutrality of care. So I think that, caring for your own soldiers allowed a nurse to be both a patriotic citizen and a good nurse, a selfless female carer. But being faced with a sick or wounded enemy patient forced nurses to challenge or break with one of those roles, which explains, I think, the hesitations, the tensions, and sometimes the ethical dilemmas that they explain in their writings. So hospitals in the First World War can be described as intimate contact zones in which different understandings of women's medical care were brought into sharp focus. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.